Hello and welcome to Literati. I'm Joseph Ike, your host on the show. This is a show where we talk to writers, producers, cultural journalists, anyone really who's involved in the process that gets these wonderful pieces of literature and content that help to shape our idea of what our culture, what makes sense, what we love, what art is to us. The show is brought to you by Glow, and with me today in the studio is someone I idolize who writes about a topic that everyone idolizes food. We have Miss Ozoz Sokoh. Let me tell you a little bit about Ozoz. In 2013, she coined the phrase New Nigerian Kitchen. And it is a phrase that describes a philosophy that celebrates and also goes about the process of documenting, we'll talk a little bit more about that, all aspects of Nigerian cuisine, but even beyond Nigerian cuisine, cuisine in general, from classical recipes to reinventing and representing, unearthing the history. We have history that go as far back as the 1920s in some of the books that we have. She's been featured on Anthony Bourdain's Parts Unknown on CNN Africa. She lives here in Lagos, but she considers herself a food explorer. Now, what you would never expect is that her background is actually in geology. And well, that's from another life. But for the last 10 years, she's been the writer of the blog Kitchen Butterfly. Ozoz, thank you so much for being here with us today on the show.
Thank you, Joseph. Happy to be here.
Great, great. So let's start off. The first and obvious question is Kitchen Butterfly. You've been doing that for 10 years. Tell us what that's about. Not just Kitchen Butterfly, more importantly, the New Nigerian Kitchen. Yes.
So Kitchen Butterfly started at a time when I was lost in the world, lost about who I was and where I was on my journey. And it basically became this safe haven that allowed me express myself, express my ideas about food, about identity, food culture, history. It was just my safe space. And so I started writing it as a blog, and over the last 10 years, it's grown into a reference for Nigerian and African cuisine, food history and culture. And yeah, it's my happy place.
Yes, and it's a happy place for a lot of us because you've exposed us to a lot of information, a lot of ideas, a lot of reimaginings that we never even thought possible. Before the show, we were talking about how something as seemingly basic as jollof rice,
Yeah.
there is so much to know about jollof rice. So take us on a brief tour of jollof rice.
Jollof rice is found everywhere along the coast of West Africa. So we're talking 14, 15, 16 countries. I think it also represents a classic rice dish that is common in many cultures, made differently, spiced. In East Africa, for instance, you'll have the pilau, which is similar, even has tomatoes, but doesn't have that vibrant red hue of jollof rice.
Okay.
So for me, it's the context of what's that dish that people consider staple, that brings people together, all the varied aspects. What are those things that unite us, that define us, that we have in common, but that we might not recognize as having in common? Yeah. So a lot of the work that I love to do that really gives me meaning, that has meaning for me, is unearthing, finding those similarities, being able to draw parallels, make the comparisons, and have people see with this eye of unity.
And it goes further to, because you described it as unearthing, because a lot of the work you do has a huge research component. Where do you find this kind of information? Like so say, let me give you a random topic, not that random, egusi soup, for example. So how would you go about, is it even a soup? How would you even go about, because when I say, okay, Ozoz, tell me everything there is to know about egusi soup.
Okay. So for me, the beginning is, I usually start with me. Like, what is it that intrigues me or that I wonder about when I think of egusi soup as a soup? because I know that, if you took a Venn diagram and we interviewed many people, there are many of us would have the same thoughts or the same questions. So I usually use myself as a pivot. Technically, egusi soup is a stew. But in Nigeria, for instance, we have a different definition for stew. Stew is red tomato-based fried mix. That's quite different from the dictionary definition of a stew. But a stew, according to dictionary definition, is usually a combination of vegetables, some roots and tubers, cooked in some liquid with meat often. So egusi soup is a stew. But let's just stick to calling it a soup.
Egusi soup, okay. Sorry, before we go too far, is this a Nigerian thing, this soup stew dichotomy? Is it something that goes to, do we find it in other African countries as well?
In other African countries, for instance, a lot of stews and sauces are described as curries or sauces. So each region basically has its own definition versus the global culinary definitions.
So there's a global culinary definition,
yes.
And then each region in Africa has its own name.
Yes.
So here in West Africa, we would call a stew a soup.
Yes. Or you see sauces, you see palava sauce, you see, and some even like in Ghana, for instance, many of the soups go by their local names depending on the region. Same thing in Nigeria, to be honest. So the names are different. I don't think there isn't one common name that is common to all, except when you're talking about some soups. So like pepper soup, for instance.
Which is like a soup.
Yeah, like a drinking soup.
Yeah.
That you'll find in many parts, in different forms, called a soup, across.
So you were saying, so for something like egusi, there's what are some of the things that stand out to you about it? That's where you would begin.
So the naming, and then I'll look at the framework of the soup, because most dishes have different components, right? Different, think of them as building blocks, right? So the building block for most Nigerian, most West African soups and stews, in fact, even curries, usually would start off with a base that sometimes has some protein, and whether that's animal protein or vegetable plant protein, and then you'd start with a stock base, and to that you would add a thickener, and in this case, the thickener could be seeds, it could be roots, tubers, gums from stems, pulses, nuts. So in this case, egusi, ogbono, all those palm nut sauce and all of those things, coconut milk. Then you have the thickeners, and then you normally would have some kind of greens, and the greens could be leafy greens or herbs. Right? And then you'd have seasoning.
Okay. Now, at this point, I am sufficiently hungry, so we need to take a quick break. So I go eat something, and then when we come back, we'll continue at the leafy green point, okay?
Hey guys, making music for you is so easy for me to do. But you know what else is super easy to do? Linking your NIN to your Glow line by dialing *109*NIN hash. Or I can call 109 from my Glow line and follow the instructions. And if I don't want to call, I can text my NIN to 109. I can even visit glowworld.com/NIN. And what if you've forgotten your NIN? All you have to do is dial *346# and Glow will help you remember it. Someone may ask, what if I haven't registered? All you have to do is go into the nearest Glow World and we'll help you register. It's that easy. So don't get disconnected from all of the amazing voice and data offers from Glow. Linking your NIN to your Glow lines is simple, safe, and 100% free with zero hassles.
And we're back. If you're just joining us, this is Literati. I'm Joseph Ike. I'm with Ozoz Sokoh. She is a writer, a food explorer, and she's taking us through the journey of how do we get information, how do we unearth the stories of, in this case, egusi soup. So we've put in the thickener and we're now on the leafy greens.
Yes, so you'd have greens, like I said, leafy greens, which is the spinach, the amaranth that are common across Africa, the bitter leaves, dandelion, so many different types of greens, or herbs, fragrant herbs, bitter herbs, and then your seasoning. And the seasonings might be traditional seasoning where we have our fermented seeds, nuts, seafood, sometimes colonial inspired, whether that's British, Indian. So like I said, take a egusi soup and you have these 4 components, and that pretty much applies to most soups, curries, sauces that we tend to make.
And you know, listening to you take us through this journey, it exposes one thing, that first of all, food is so basic. I mean, it's, everybody knows it's food. How did you get to the point of taking something so basic and beginning this process of unearthing so many wonderful things about, I mean, because we have this book and this book, there's so much to learn about something that we feel like, oh, it's basic. How did you get to this point?
I found myself living abroad a couple of times, and during those stays, it's always baffled me why African food is not on the map, and how little people knew about African food. French cuisine is so well researched and so well documented that it is almost commonplace. Yeah, everybody knows it's the standard for gourmet and all of that. And I realized that our lack of food media is a problem. Yeah, not having a reference. Across Africa, we know so many things by the traditional names, which is excellent and which needs to be preserved. It's also nice to know what the scientific, botanical, English, common use names are, because in that process we might find things that unite us. Food is basic, but I always think of it as more than eating. There's so much more behind it. I mean, there's so much on the journey of from seed to our plates, and it's important to understand the different aspects, because sometimes there are challenges across that value chain, and understanding them helps us treat them better, one, appreciate them, and also there might be opportunities for us to help develop various aspects better. So for me, I'm just interested in how we live better lives, and how we can get the very best food, as simple as it is, to our tables.
You make a strong argument that you can't tell the story of a people without the story of their food.
You can't.
Then you extend the argument that you can't tell the story of a people's food without the story of their food, the story of the components of the food. You're absolutely right. We understand the context the best, and so we are in the best position to document it. Seemingly very common sense, one would say. But why hasn't this happened?
We've just taken it for granted. It's these things will always be around us, and then one day they aren't. But it's just, we just have to value what's ours. The way we value our music and our fashion and fabric. This is also an essential component, and we just need to give it the value and the credit that it's due it. And this is what led me to documenting and to thinking about the new Nigerian cuisine and new Nigerian kitchen. It's about looking at what we've lost already. I do that a lot by finding old cookbooks and trying to chart. There's so many recipes that people don't even know anymore. People don't cook, mostly in the cities, because obviously in some of the rural areas and more of the quieter parts, people still hold true to tradition. But we lack those bridges and those connects. So for me, it's about preserving what was. It's about looking at ingredients and saying, I'm not going to let okra or zobo, for instance, hibiscus sabatiferum, which we use to make a popular drink. I'm not going to limit its use to just a drink. What else can I do with the zobo flowers when I'm done making the infusion for the drink? How many ways can we explore the uses of yam in not just traditional savory cooking, but how can we introduce yam into sweet cooking and desserts? It's about understanding the current state, but also exploring future uses. How can we get the most and the best out of a particular ingredient? So take pineapples, for instance. Most times we eat the fruit, we discard the skin, but the skin can make wonderful drinks. You boil with some spices, sweetener, and you have this refreshing drink. You can have hot, you can have cold. So, I mean, how can we take total advantage? How can we make the most? How can we fully explore, the depth of the fruit? Take the African star apple. The Nigerian fruits known as agbalumo, udara. In Ghana, it's known as alasa. It's a seasonal fruit available from early December to mid-May in many parts of West Africa.
It's round. It's
orange,
we pop it like
round.
that.
We press it. It reminds some people of a fruit they call sapote.
Okay.
Mami sapote. It also looks like a loquat for and medlar for people who are more familiar with Asian fruits. And it's just a beloved thing that we would eat
Very
as
much
children. And you'd find them selling it outside school gates in many parts of Nigeria and West Africa and on the streets. And but just reading a bit more and learning a bit more about it from research papers. There's so many Nigerian research papers and African research papers on food. So many. And if you spend some time looking at the research papers, the amount of information you get back is enormous. So
wow.
That's where you find information about the nutritional qualities and then just different aspects. I learned that you could extract pectin from agbalumo, the skin, and just imagine how useful that would be in many industries.
Yeah.
So yes, it's food, but I think that there's an approach that some of us might have to take that looks at it in all its dimensions and how we can fully extract the benefits and uses.
Before we go far or away from this particular subject, because this is one that is exciting to me. Agbalumo is a part of, you said the name in Ghana. For a lot of us, it's a part of our childhood history. So when we come back from the break, we're going to go back to the African star apple, which is the name that a lot of us did not know it was called. We thought it was a cherry. And learn a lot more about how having this conversation and telling this story helps us to make a lot more sense of what seemingly is a basic idea when we get back from the break.
Can you see me now? We're just having a good time, and I'm feeling so good tonight.
Where you did?
I dey come now, you go see me now. You go.
Call your party and everybody, yeah. Make we start to the corner.
Where you did now?
You go see me now.
Everybody they dance.
Where you did now?
Oh, you go see me now.
Even
I'm fine, sir. Even me, I surprised.
Hey, where you at?
Hello, how are you?
Tell us one truth nobody knows.
I like to steam it from my mama pot.
Glow, the best data plans in town. Dial *777#.
You're welcome back. If you're just joining us, we are still on Literati with the food sage, Ozoz Sokoh, telling us things that we did not even begin to think about. This is just one of many books that you've contributed. There's some of your work in there. You have a blog, Kitchen Butterfly, where a lot more of this information could be found. And you could join the conversation. We have a social media handle. Handle is @NewsCentralTV, #NC Literati. So Ozoz, you were telling us about the agbalumo fruit. And why this is particularly exciting for me is we knew it as cherry. We knew when it's time for cherry. And when you say there's cherry or agbalumo, everyone knows what you're talking about. But it's not actually a cherry.
No, it's not a cherry. But I remember having it once, and I'd had sour cherries in the US, and my friend and I were talking, and we're like, yeah, that has a slight sour cherry taste. So it might have come from there.
Oh, okay.
Botanically, cherries have a seed in the center and the fruit around it. So there might be some similarity there. But it's just, for me, it's been this thing, like, when I think about the new Nigerian kitchen and some of the work, it's like taking things like agbalumo and saying, okay, yes, we've eaten agbalumo all our lives, but what else can we do? Can we make it into jams? Can we make it into drinks? Can we bake with it? Those are some of the questions that I typically would ask myself about an old and familiar fruit as well as a new fruit or vegetable.
Yeah.
And I would go on to test different things, you know, all the ways possible: pickle, fry, bake, and there'll be many failures, but there'll also be many successes. And I think at the heart of learning is in those failures. It's in what didn't work, why didn't it work? If I wanted to make it work, what would I have to change? And it's quite easy for me to apply that sort of reasoning because of my scientific geological background. I'm able to adopt almost an experiment sort of approach to, okay, what's my theory? This is what I plan to do, and this is how I'm going to do it, and this is what I'm going to record. And I'm also very big on observation, and that really helps me. I may not know about a thing, but just being able to observe the color, the shape, the size, quite often helps me find out more about it. Just being able to describe it, or to use my sensory skills. So what do I see, smell, taste, hear, feel? Those sorts of approaches have been so important in documenting, exploring, recreating and reimagining ingredients, but also dishes.
Okay. So what do we look forward to? What's coming up? What are you working on?
So I'm just basically really focused now on documenting Nigerian food in various forms. The seasonal produce calendar is one of them. And seasonal produce calendar is something that I worked on for about 4 or 5 years before I first published it. And it basically looked at when fruits and vegetables were in season. And the idea is just to continue building on that, helping people know what they can do with the fruits and vegetables.
Is that just Nigerian, though?
That's just Nigerian. But I've also shared the template and format with a few friends from across Africa. Because it's something that could easily be replicated for other countries. It'll just require some observation, working with maybe farmers sometimes and gardeners, people who know what is in season and when. And it's something that can be revised several times. So there's a template that obviously I'm willing to share with people who want to create something similar for their own countries across Africa and across the world.
I tried convincing myself I'm not going to ask you this question, but I know that I can't get away from asking. So then there comes the eating. In the last 3 years, tell us about 5 new dishes that have taken you by surprise.
That I've made?
That you've come, like you could say, I did not expect that.
Okay. There's a dish I call Coco's Bangus.
Coco's Bangus.
Coco's Bangus.
Okay.
It's a mix of coconut flavor and banga, palm nut flavor. And I most commonly do that in a rice dish. So it's like a coconut rice that is also like a banga rice. And it's just this creamy, delicious delight. So that's one. The second one is cassava and coconut salad I make that, every time I taste it, it blows my mind.
Oh my God.
And it's just very, it was inspired.
You're bringing tears to my eyes. I'm thinking, how am I going to survive that? We're just on number 2. Okay.
It's a very simple recipe of grated cassava, coconut, herbs, Sometimes I add seafood, nuts. It's just texture. Visually, it's beautiful because there's lots of whites, greens, and reds. So it's a vibrant salad, inspired by street food. The street food dish of cassava and coconut. And then there is a drink I make with agbalumo, the African staple.
There's an agbalumo drink?
There's several agbalumo drinks.
There's several.
But this drink is, it's just figuring out how to extract flavor from the flesh and the seeds and combining them. It is, I call it agbalulade, like lemonade, but it is, when agbalumo is in season, I buy huge amounts, process it, basically preserve it, take it apart, remove the skin, separate the skin from the flesh and the seeds, and then freeze them in bags, and then make this drink that on ice with a bit of lime is heavenly. The other one is I make a hibiscus Chapman. Like, so take the regular Chapman, and rather than use Ribena or a blackcurrant base, I make a hibiscus cordial and use that instead, and then use local bitters. So in Nigeria origin, in Ghana you could use alomo, use whatever bitters you find in your country, and it is amazing. And then the fifth one, uziza. So uziza is, you have the uziza leaf, which is known as, it's like the African black pepper. It's quite often you find it dried, but when you find the fresh ones, you can make an amazing butter by basically just crushing the fresh peppercorns and incorporating that with a pinch of salt in some butter, and then having that on toast or any kind of meat, or toss in some vegetables, and it's just fresh and fragrant. Like the African peppercorns are more fragrant and slightly sweeter than the pepper nigrum, which is like the regular peppercorn. So it's just this, and you can also use that in like all sorts of things. So those are in my Hall of Fame.
You know, we started this, I took a break to eat something, and now, well, thankfully we're coming to the close of today's episode because I am starving.
So am
and I want all five that you've said. Ozoz, thank you so much for being on the show, and thank you guys for joining us today on Literati. Check out Kitchen Butterfly, the blog. There's so much that you have to learn about our story, our food story, not just the history of it, but where the story is going. You could be a part of the conversation. Follow us on our social media handle at News Central TV, hashtag NC Literati. Ozoz, thank you so much for being with us, and thank you guys once more.